They say that the best lies are garnished and carefully surrounded by the truth.
It is with great reluctance that I have agreed to this calling. I love democracy. I love the Republic.
I mean, Palpatine definitely isn't that reluctant to accept the emergency powers given to him by the Senate. But he definitely does love democracy. You can feel his passion oozing from this delivery. Palpatine loved to subvert the Republic, use its own institutions and politics to carefully seize more and more power. Palpatine loved the fact that he could convince the voting populace and political system to do his bidding as he orchestrated one of the greatest conflicts in galactic history. He created such fear and uncertainty that the people themselves delivered the Republic directly into his hands and helped him subvert the sacred balance between the various branches of government and destroy the Republic's 1,000-year pledge to peace and disarmament. So yeah, we can directly blame Darth Sidious and probably his master Darth Plagueis for kicking off the Clone Wars, but I would argue these two individuals were simply triggermen for a conflict that was tens of thousands of years in the making. Before we get there though, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, ownersaber.com. One of the premier destinations for completely legally obtained lightsabers that have not been looted from the battlefields of the Clone Wars. ownersaber.com has some truly awesome replica blades that are designed with quality and attention to detail. Like this guy right here, called the Black Moon Saber, also known as the Dark Saber by the Mandalorians. It's only like their symbol of leadership and the only lightsaber ever crafted by a Mandalorian. No big deal. I also really like the Samurai Blade set, which includes a longer katana and a shorter Soto lightsaber. This is based off of Ahsoka Tano's lightsabers after the Clone Wars. Great for some dual wielding. I also want to mention to you guys that ownersaber.com will now be rolling out Afterpay at checkout. This splits the payment of a lightsaber into 4 to 6 weekly payments. Now you have to be older than 18 to use the service, and guys, please be careful. There are no hidden costs. There are no interest payments, but if you miss a payment, there are going to be late fees and this will stack up. I highly recommend you don't do that. So you might not need to be a Jedi to purchase one of these lightsabers with Afterpay, but I highly recommend you be financially disciplined before you use the service. And also, all lightsabers right now are 30% off with free shipping, and you can use our promo code EWOK, all caps, for an additional $15 off. Okay, so the Clone Wars should actually be called the Galactic Civil War, whereas the Galactic Civil War was more like a galactic revolution or something. And civil wars are a complete tragedy because the government, the people, are unable to come to a compromise to prevent war, even though they share a lot of economic, political, and cultural values. I'm writing this script on America's Memorial Day, which is not a day of celebration, but a day of remembrance for all the sacrifices men and women in this country have given. Regardless of politics or personal ideology, I think it's important to respect these individuals who went overseas, went to war, and never returned so that we wouldn't have to do it in their place. And since 1775, around 1.35 million Americans have died in service, and close to half of those deaths actually came during the American Civil War. 655,000 American lives were lost in that devastating conflict where brother fought brother, where every casualty and even the most flawless victory ended with just more dead Americans. And the one thing I really want to highlight about a civil war is that it's never orchestrated by just one or two evil actors. While many Confederates saw Lincoln as an aggressor despite his attempts to defuse the crisis, others blame the South for moving so swiftly after the 1860s election, and of course for opening fire on the Union-held Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. But the truth is, the North and the South chose very different paths a long time ago, and this is what really led to the conflict. The North had a higher population, and its working class was made up of free men and women, and its economy was rapidly transforming into an industrial powerhouse. The South still depended heavily on cash crops. Cotton in those days was a prized commodity, not so different in value from oil in today's economy. And it was a heavily labor-intensive industry. In 1862, 1 out of every 65 people alive were involved in the cotton industry. And America produced roughly 80% of the global demand for it before the Civil War started, and it made up more than 60% of America's exports. Which is insane and would force most modern-day economists to scream, diversify, diversify, diversify. All of this heavily depended on slave labor, well, at least culturally it did. You had this small minority group of extremely wealthy plantation owners who had this incentive to keep the system in place, and this was detrimental not only to the slaves, obviously, but also to all of the poor white families who had no economic development because there was such inequality in wealth. The North, for many decades, rightly saw that industrialization would be the future. It also saw slavery as a great evil, but also as a less efficient system. Farms in the North were usually family-run, and they usually focused on different types of crops. So this was a conflict in the making for decades, if not centuries. I mean, you could even trace the problems here back to the foundation of the country, back to the Declaration of Independence, an alliance of convenience made by a group of colonies that were very different from one another. And so the Clone Wars, despite being compared to America's War on Terror a lot, actually reminds me a lot more of the American Civil War. I mean, minus Palpatine orchestrating everything, of course. Again, Palpatine, I think, just inflamed tensions that are deeply rooted in causes that started all the way back to 25,000 years ago with the foundation of the Old Republic. Now, prior to 25,000 BBY, the Rakan Infinite Empire ruled over much of the known galaxy. The Rakans were a species of vicious, dark side force wielders, and they enslaved every species they ran into and exported them to many of their worlds. Their fall from power occurred as rapidly as their rise to power. A mysterious plague, most likely created by the Force itself, cut the Rakans off from their own Force abilities. And since most of their technology ran on dark side Force powers, they were suddenly stranded all across the galaxy with no advanced technology. And so within a few generations, the Rakan Empire more or less collapsed. What was left were various groups of slaves that had been seeded all across the galaxy by the Rakan Infinite Empire. On worlds like Chandrilla, Alderaan, and Coruscant, in the core you had the largest concentrations, and these worlds basically created an alliance that turned into the Republic. And this Republic, since it was founded by slaves, was based on the principles of individual freedom, rights, and also a representative democracy. This early version of the Old Republic sought to expand quickly outwards, reconnecting the territory of the Old Rakan Empire together once again. But because they didn't have hyperdrive technology, these individuals had to use sleeper ships or generational ships, and this took a really long time to reach the more peripheral areas of the galaxy. And so the core worlds would experience a huge economic and population boom as these generational ships started going out to the other territories. And these peripheral regions would always stay a step behind from the core. Wars of influence would be fought between the Republic and newly encountered factions in the peripherals of their territory, like the Alsakins and the Tionese. Now, if you take a close look at the galactic map, you'll notice that the Republic is kind of like a tree. It's arranged in rings, and the outer ring represents the latest growth, while the core represents the oldest. These rings can tell you the story of the Republic, as well as a tree can tell you about the climate it grew up in. And if you take a look at the individual names of each territory, each ring, you'll notice that outside of the core is an area called the colonies, which indicates at one point this region was considered the peripherals, or last frontier before you go into the unknown. But eventually the colonies became well established themselves, with major industrial worlds like Fondor and Karita being established. And so the ring outside of the colonies ring became known as the Inner Rim, which was followed by the Expansion region, another name that seems to indicate that this was now the peripherals of the galaxy. But if you go one further layer, we arrive to the Mid Rim, which actually is the last layer of the galaxy that actually has consistently had a Republic presence throughout the years. I know this is all really confusing, but this is what happens when you don't have like a real strict plan or naming convention. The Outer Rim, Wild Space, and Unknown Region are the final frontiers of the galaxy, and they'll remain that way because they're all that lies between civilized space and the cold embrace of deep space. Now, during this early expansion period, it was relatively easy for new member worlds to apply for membership, and soon you had hundreds of different worlds being represented in the Republic. But when that number reached into the thousands and it became clear that the old representative democracy system of the Senate was being overwhelmed by the sheer amount of voices that now took place in the political process, the Republic quickly enacted reforms. It became apparent that individual planets, even individual solar systems, could no longer have direct representation anymore. The Republic would be organized into different sectors, and each sector would have their own representation. For instance, the Chommel sector in the Mid-Rim is a lightly populated sector. It had 36 full member worlds and over 40,000 settled entities amongst more than 300 million stars. And they were all represented by one senator, which at one point was Sheev Palpatine himself. Now, I'm sure you guys notice a problem here. I mean, the dizzying amounts of layers of representation here has to create some problems, right? I mean, you have your local government for a city like Theed, then you have a government that represents individual groups like the Naboo Monarch, and then you also have the big boss of the Gungan High Council. Within the Chamel sector itself, all of the member worlds most likely had their own council that would inform the representative for the entire sector. Then the senator of the Chamel sector gets one vote in the larger Galactic Senate. And as you can see, during the invasion of Naboo, one sector's lone voice, even in the face of such egregious and blatant aggression, was not able to do much against the much larger and more powerful corporate entities, which actually got direct representation themselves. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Yet, in a way, Naboo actually had direct representation in the Senate because both Padme and Palpatine were from Naboo. By the time the Outer Rim planets began applying for membership within the Republic, the waiting line was so long that it could take hundreds, if not thousands of years for that membership to be cleared. And that's because not only did the core worlds realize that the Senate was growing out of control when it came to size, but they also wanted to preserve their own interests and not have their power diluted by what they saw as backwater planets with very little value. And so it started a process of taxation without representation and no services. The Old Republic was always famous for concentrating on economic growth rather than military power. And so whenever an outside entity attacked, whether it was the Sith Empire, the Mandalorians, or even the Yuuzhan Vong, the Republic would often use these Outer Rim territories sort of as a buffer region to slow down invasions. And so the Outer Rim experienced some of the worst tragedies and massacres in galactic history. In 3973 BBY, the Old Republic and Jedi stood by as a Mandalorian war party descended on the planet of Cathar and drove the local inhabitants to extinction. It wasn't until the Siege of Taris more than 10 years later that the Republic would spring into action against the Mandalorian Crusades. And that's because Taris was a mid-Rennu Seminopolis planet with great economic importance. The Republic would, of course, retool its industrial capabilities from making speeders into making starfighters, from hydrospanners into blaster rifles. And so while the core regions of the galaxy experienced long periods of peace and stability, allowing for the development of complex and advanced industries that formed the core of the economic foundation for the Republic, the Outer Rim regions was repeatedly neglected, raised by bandits, pirates, Sith Lords, and degenerate Xenos. And so you really couldn't build anything long-term or predict what would happen long-term in these regions, and this was a terrible environment for business to occur in. And the Republic could never really establish a large or permanent military presence in the Outer Rim. This area of the galaxy has always been too sparsely populated and poor to sustain larger security forces adequate enough to protect these areas. And as a result, the lack of security discouraged capital investment, which discouraged people from moving into this area, which in turn led to a lack of funding and manpower for security forces. And so as you can see, the Outer Rim became subject to a vicious cycle of poverty, lack of security, and lack of investment, followed by more poverty, and so on. Now, in the Republic's defense, there were attempts to do something about this issue. During the High Republic period, widely seen as the golden age of the Republic and the Jedi Order, the Starlight Beacon Station was built in the Outer Rim as sort of a police station for the region. Jedi Quick Reaction Forces were based here permanently. But still, the Jedi faced the same problem that every other security force has faced when it came to governing the Outer Rim. There was simply too much area for them to cover. Which led us finally to the creation of the Outer Rim Free Trade Zone in 124 BBY by the Galactic Senate. The idea was by removing trade regulations and tariffs, it would attract capital investment from corporations that might be more tolerant to higher risk. Of course, established companies like Quad Drive Yards and the Corellian Engineering Corporation would avoid such risky projects. Smaller and medium-sized corporations like the Trade Federation, which at the time was quite small, jumped at the opportunity to give themselves an advantage over their larger competitors. Soon, other entities like the Intergalactic Banking Clan, the Corporate Alliance, and the Trade Federation would also begin setting up shop. When I say that the Republic neglected the Outer Rim, I don't just mean when it comes to security issues. I mean when it comes to everything. There were no administrative bodies there, no monitors to make sure these corporations were doing the right thing. And so soon it became apparent that these corporate powers were taking advantage of the Republic's lack of presence in these areas, and soon organizations like the Trade Federation were destroying all competition in the region and even trapping the locals into indentured servitude. The Trade Federation also controlled most of the trade flowing from the Outer Rim to the core and vice versa. This meant that they could also control pricing for everyday goods. This was a really messed up situation. Furthermore, all of these corporate entities also started establishing their own private military forces in order to guard their assets. The Trade Defense Force would be established by the Trade Federation, and it served as a precursor to the Confederate military during the Clone Wars. The situation became so bad that small conflicts began to emerge, like the Stark Hyperspace War, a battle between a group of pirates and smugglers and the Trade Federation. All the Sith really had to do during this time was to fund organizations that increased the hostility between the Outer Rim and the core regions. The Sith and Legends would even try to start an uprising with the violent Yunchuri warrior race. The idea was to kill as many Jedi as possible, but also undermine their authority and the galaxy's belief in them. Finally, in 67 BBY, the Republic Senate decided enough was enough and began proposing reforms to the Outer Rim Free Trade Zone. What they wanted to do was to break up the monopolies of the Outer Rim and give more power to local smaller businesses. And then finally, in 32 BBY, the Senate had enough and passed Prop 31814D, which finally reintroduced taxation into the Outer Rim. This, of course, pissed off all of the corporate powers operating there and even led to the invasion of Naboo by the Trade Federation. A clear sign of the wider conflict that would come. When Count Dooku gave his Raxus address a little less than 10 years later, his condemnation of the Senate and their Jedi Guardians rang true with the citizens of the Outer Rim. They rightfully believed that the Republic neglected them. They loved Dooku because he was a former Jedi, and he was in a way a representative of the Republic. His defection to the Separatist side justified all of their anger and grievances they had held against the Republic for thousands of years. The Outer Rim was suffering from generational trauma, which created generational mistrust of the rest of the galaxy. And without it, it doesn't matter how much money Plagueis and Sidious pumped into the Separatist movement, it never would have solidified and turned into something real unless there were actual grievances being held. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, the democracy.